Getting back to conditioning now, there's at least one more important, well, really important figure that we need to consider. Probably the most influential and memorable of theorists on conditioning, B.F. Skinner, the man who pursued and popularized the movement in radical behaviorism begun by John Watson. The insistence that learned, observable behavior was the only thing worthy of psychological study. Skinner was born in 1904 in Pennsylvania and died of leukemia in 1990. A good, long, and very productive life, although it wasn't psychology that first drew his attention. Skinner early on decided that he was meant to be a writer. In fact, he majored in literature at Hamilton College in New York, but after graduation, he quickly became disappointed with his own fiction and went back to school. Harvard this time, majoring in psychology, which Skinner defined as the science of human behavior. And in that field, Skinner absolutely excelled. He was a determined scientific researcher, a prolific writer, inventor, professor of psychology at Harvard University, and most definitely a pioneer in radical behaviorism. Never to take a second place in anything he did, Skinner took the ideas of previous researchers, of men like Pavlov, Thorndike, and Watson, and carried all those ideas one step further. Skinner believed that Thorndike was on the right track with his instrumental conditioning, with the rewards and punishments and behavior being shaped by consequences. Very good. But Skinner felt that Thorndike had gone too far in the direction of acknowledging mental or emotional variables. Remember the cat in Thorndike's puzzle box? Imagine how good the cat must have felt when it finally got out of that blasted box and reached the food. Thorndike did. He imagined the cat's feelings. However, while Thorndike took emotions into consideration and described the pleasure that no doubt stemmed from the food rewarded to the cat, Skinner argued that pleasure could not be measured, and therefore, let's just say the cat reached the food and that the food acted as a reward, increasing the likelihood that the cat would repeat the behavior of hitting the lever. Pleasure, in other words, has nothing to do with it. Learning is all about observable behavior. For Skinner, it's the behavior of the individual that concerns us, including what that individual says or does about their unseen thoughts and ideas and dreams. We cannot study a man's dreams as Freud would have done, nor should we try. But we can always study a man's behavior in talking about his dreams or in dealing with them. And learned behavior, Skinner argued, is the result of three important variables: antecedents, behavior, and consequences. Behavior and consequences we know, right? But what about antecedents? Well, antecedents are those stimuli or conditions which cause the original behavior. These could be genetic stimuli, internal, biological factors, external, environmental factors, whatever. However, the behavior occurs initially, it happens. The individual behaves, acts, does something. So the antecedents lead to the behavior at first. But then, with each behavior, there are a number of possible consequences. And depending on the consequences of the behavior, the individual might repeat that behavior, avoid it, or simply not have any pertinent response to it at all. And that process of learning behavior, Skinner called operant conditioning, because behavior that operates on the environment might produce consequences that lead to reinforcement. So what is reinforcement? Well, reinforcement is a fundamental notion in Skinner's take on psychology. And what it means basically is that a reinforcer is an event that increases the likelihood that the behavior that precedes it will happen again. That's what Thorndike would call a reward. In other words, if you do something that brings a positive result, for example, Thorndike's cat hitting the lever, and because of that, the cat gets some food, then the food becomes a reinforcer. And reinforcers happen all the time. When a teacher encourages a student for something they've said in class, the student is more likely to speak up again. Or when the student gets a good grade after studying for a hard test, the grade becomes a positive reinforcer. The student is more likely to study hard for other tests. But not all reinforcers are positive. There are negative ones too. A positive reinforcer is something like a reward. You do a good job and you get a reward, and so you do a good job again. A negative reinforcer will also increase the probability that you'll repeat that behavior. But it does so not by giving you something good, but removing something bad or painful, something you don't want. Either way, your behavior has been reinforced, and so Skinner would say, you have learned. But Skinner did not leap to these conclusions through sheer imagination. He was a scientist, and remember what scientists do: observe, experiment, and measure. And you may recall that I said Skinner was an inventor. Well, one of his greatest inventions was also a box. Not a simple crate-like puzzle box like Thorndike's box. No, the operant conditioning chamber, commonly referred to as a Skinner box, was a highly effective means of measuring exactly how much learning was taking place in a subject. What a Skinner box does is it allows the researcher to carefully control and measure the subject's behavior, whatever the subject is, a rat, a pigeon, you name it. And at the same time, you can control the reward and punishment the subject receives. How much reward or punishment, when they receive it, how long the reward or punishment lasts. And in this way, Skinner was able to determine how increases in reward and punishment could have a direct relationship to how quickly and how effectively the subject learns. In experiments with rats, for example, rats could obtain food in the Skinner box by pressing a button, which is a form of positive reinforcement, right? Or in a different experiment, rats were given a mild electric shock inside the box with no way of getting out of the box, but they could stop the shock, again, by pressing a button. They get the shock, it hurts. They push the button, the pain stops. The shock is a negative reinforcement or a negative reinforcer. Remember, negative reinforcers encourage behaviors that remove something bad. But that's not a punishment, is it? With a punishment, if you do something and you're punished, you are less likely to do it again. If a child yells in the house and the mother gives the child a timeout for yelling, the child is less likely to keep yelling. If a student doesn't study for a test, instead he plays around and consequently fails, the student should be less likely to goof off before the next test, right? Well, at least one would hope so.